On May 25th, 2020, when Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes, killing him in full view of video cameras, many Americans asked, how could this happen? And many of us vowed to never let it happen again. I'm Brian Brown, and this is my video series on structural racism in America for the East Hampton Public Schools. Racism is our problem, and if we're going to fix it, we have to understand it. So we've just been talking a lot about the civil rights movement, and I thought it would be helpful if we did sort of a deep dive on one story. I really want to try to explain, I really want to try to illustrate to you just how deeply entrenched structural racism is in our country. All right, and so I thought I would take a story that that probably most of us know a little bit about, and just show you the way that this system works. Okay, because the problem is, anytime that we feel like we have a victory towards equality, we have a victory towards human rights, and so on and so forth in America, along the lines of fighting against racism and stuff like that, the system adapts, it changes. So this is a good example. So today I want to talk about the 1954 case of Brown versus the Board of Education. So to remind you from a few lessons ago, or from stuff you already know, that segregation was made legal by the Supreme Court in 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And if you remember, this guy, Homer Plessy, who was black, bought a ticket on a train to the white section. They asked him to leave. He refused to leave. He got arrested. They were really trying to fight against segregation in the South using the 14th Amendment. Anyway, the plan backfired, and it actually made segregation legal, and so we see the era of Jim Crow really come in at this point and last until the mid-1960s. So one of the huge blows to legal segregation was the 1954 case that involved a 8-year-old girl named Linda Brown. So Linda Brown was black. She lived in Topeka, Kansas, and she lived 3 blocks from a school. And but that school was a white school. There was a black school, and she was supposed to attend the black school, but it was way across town. They were going to have to bus her, and her dad sued the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, to say, this school is right near my kid's house. My kid should be able to go to the school. Segregation is supposed to be illegal. What's the deal? So the NAACP, and remember we talked about the NAACP, this is a civil rights organization that mainly is using the courts to try to fight against racism. And so, one of their probably their most famous attorney who worked for the NAACP was Thurgood Marshall. And so the NAACP had been trying for a few years to try to chip away at segregation and stuff like that. So like, I want to say it was in Missouri. They sued a law school, said that they wouldn't allow, this is a state school, that their law school wouldn't allow black people to join. And they said, okay, well then you have to build, like, these black people are qualified to go there, you have to build a separate law school that's equal, right? Separate but equal. You have to build another law school then for black students if you're not going to admit them with white students. Anyway, so they were trying all these different strategies, but they saw in this a case where they might really be able to just go for it and outlaw segregation in schools. And as I've said before, schools are the biggest institution in society, right? Everybody goes through schools. So Thurgood Marshall's argument is that we don't have equal institutions, right? Plessy versus Ferguson says you can have separate institutions for black and white as long as they are equal, all right? And so Marshall brought in all sorts of evidence to show that when there are separate institutions, when there are two segregated schools in a city or 10 or whatever you want to say, that, look at the textbooks in the white school, look at the textbooks in the black school, look at the desks, look at the structure, look at the, so on and so forth. And you go through the whole list and see that nowhere where there was separate was there equal. Thurgood Marshall also used evidence from the field of psychology, from sociology as well, basically saying that not only are the institutions themselves unequal, but merely by forcing black students to go to a separate segregated school, that it had a huge impact on their self-esteem, that it basically it was creating a better opportunity for white people, but that black people were hindered not only by having inferior institutions, but also just by the nature of being sort of forced to go to these schools. It was another barricade towards people being successful. Okay, so anyway, so the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time was Earl Warren. He was actually appointed after the first sort of arguments were even sort of started to be made in this case. So he comes in around 1953 or something like that. But anyway, so the court hears the arguments, and there's like a 7-2 majority in support for Brown versus Board of Education. But Warren wants the court to be unanimous. All right, he feels so strongly about this case that he wants it to be unanimous. And so he holds out on a decision, and he's trying to convince these other two justices that they should support Brown v. Board of Education, that they should overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. And so he negotiates and he compromises, and they issue a unanimous decision that basically says that when you have separate facilities, they are inherently unequal, and so we have to desegregate schools. We have to throw out any sort of language from Plessy versus Ferguson as it applies to schools. And this, of course, is going to open the door to desegregating everything. All right, but at this point, today we're just going to talk about schools. Okay, and so this is a huge victory. Like, hooray, right? Equality. People have to stop segregating in schools. Kids will have that equal opportunity that we're supposed to be about here in America, right? When we're feeling patriotic about America, right? These are the things that we talk about, right? About the equality of opportunity and so on and so forth for all Americans. And man, we are gonna live up to that. Awesome. Okay? And that's as far as we really learn, for the most part, about school desegregation. Almost all of us. If you've heard anything about it at all, you've heard Brown versus Board of Education. Maybe you've seen a picture of Linda Brown and Thurgood Marshall arguing the case, and so on and so forth. Thurgood Marshall, by the way, would end up being the first black justice of the Supreme Court. Anyway, that's not the end of the story. It's not the end of the story by a long shot. By the way, Warren was appointed by Eisenhower. Eisenhower was pretty vocal about being pretty mad about this decision. That's going to be important later, because Eisenhower is still going to do the right thing, but we'll get to that. All right. So why am I talking about this in a discussion about how the system adapts to continue being racist? Well, here's the start of it. All right. So first of all, for Warren to convince the other two justices that they should support it and make a unanimous decision, he had to agree that they would wait a year before they would release their recommendations for how to do this. Okay, so 1954, hooray! All right, Brown wins. In this case, we've got to desegregate schools. All right, but we're going to wait a year to tell you how we think you should do it. So that's the first sort of setback, is they've got to wait. Well, then their recommendation is problematic. All right. Basically, what they say is that they're going to leave it to school boards to state school boards to decide how they're going to desegregate. And that they would sort of put district judges, so that these are federal judges, they put them in charge of sort of overseeing it, but they didn't really specify how any of that would work. Okay? And so we have to remember, as we're, if you're active in trying to, fight against racism, make the world a more equal place, and so on and so forth, just because there's one victory doesn't mean that things are going to work out the way that it seems like they are. Okay? And so this is one of those cases. So yes, schools have to desegregate, all right, but we're going to leave it up to state education boards to figure out how they do that. And we're going to put judges in charge, but we're not really going to specify that judges are going to inspect the schools or whatever they're going to do. So a lot of schools do nothing. State education boards, in many cases, all right, they're worried that they're going to get sued if some of the schools don't desegregate well enough, all right? A lot of states are against desegregation, actively against it. More on that in a moment, all right? But what the states do is they actually take the power, they transfer the power of deciding who's going to assign students to local districts, okay? So that would be like if DESE in Massachusetts, our Board of Education, all right, is supposed to desegregate the schools, and they're like, well, we're just going to leave it up to the towns to figure out how to do that, all right? And what that does is, it means that if the state of Massachusetts doesn't desegregate schools, which it doesn't, NAACP can't sue Massachusetts. They have to go to all the different districts that aren't desegregating and sort of sue them one at a time. So these states sort of unload their liability in this situation. They give it to the local school boards, okay? And then, a lot of school boards don't do much. In a lot of southern states, local school boards actually take school property, government property, all right, and they give it to these all-white academies. And they say, oh, okay, that school over there, it's not part of our public district anymore. We're basically granting it to this other educational institution, which just happens to be not state-sponsored, and so that they can discriminate. All right? So that's nothing compared to some of the other stuff that happens. Okay, so in 1956, so remember the Supreme Court case, 1954, the actual ruling about what's going to be done with it, 1955. In 1956, 101 members of Congress, so representatives from the Senate and the House of Representatives, they signed this thing called the Southern Manifesto. It was originally authored by Strom Thurmond, who's a pretty infamous guy, if you know who that is. Anyway, senators and representatives, 101 of them, and they basically all said that they were going to do whatever they could to resist Brown versus the Board of Education. They complained that Brown versus the Board of Education was the judicial branch being overreaching its power in trying to force the states and municipalities to desegregate, and that they were going to do everything that they could to resist it, to fight against it, to work around it. All right, here are the states whose representatives signed this thing: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. Okay? Here are the states where every one of their congressional representatives in the House and in the Senate signed the Southern Manifesto, saying that they were going to actively resist, in any way possible, desegregation of public schools. Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia. I think there were like 3 representatives in all that didn't sign the thing. Might have been a few more. I should have looked it up. They pledged to use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of this decision, which is contrary to the Constitution, and to prevent the use of force in its implementation. Okay, so that's the Southern Manifesto. It's signed in 1956 by members of the federal government who are resisting a different branch, the legislative branch resisting the judicial branch of the federal government. All right, let's go to 1957. Here's a story you might have heard, the Little Rock Nine. So, the governor of Arkansas is a guy by the name of Orville Faubus. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Orville Faubus ran for governor on a heavy platform of the Southern Manifesto. He basically said, I'm against school desegregation. I'm going to fight to keep schools as segregated as I can. He won. He was the governor, as I just said. So, Little Rock, Arkansas, the superintendent had to put in a plan for how they were going to desegregate the schools. Everybody's doing something, all right? And so the superintendent of the city of Little Rock says, okay, well, there's Central High School is traditionally a white school. We are going to take the 9 best, most highly achieving black students in the city, and we're going to send them to Central High, all right, where they're, of course, vastly outnumbered. But that's going to be the plan, and that's stage 1. And then slowly they would bring more black students into Central, and then eventually to I think there were 4 high schools in town. They were going to move kids around, and and then the younger grades as well. All right. On the first day of school, Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, had already been whipping up a crowd to be in absolute resistance to this, really encouraging white people to show up and harass these 9 teenagers who were about to walk into and desegregate a white school. But Faubus didn't stop there. He actually sent the National Guard. All right, so the National Guard is a state militia. The governor is in charge of that state militia. They can dispatch them, as they see fit, within obvious reason. Although this is unreasonable. So he sent the National Guard to prevent these kids from going to high school. These kids tried to go. National Guard is blocking their way. There's mobs of white people shouting at them, yelling at them. There's a story, I don't remember which of the Little Rock Nine it was, but she's talking about it, and she says, there's like soldiers in my face, and there's mobs of people just screaming the most horrible stuff at me, throwing stuff at me, and so on forth. And I like looked through the crowd to find a friendly face, and I found this old white woman who I like locked eyes with, and I was just kind of like, you're an old lady, like you're somebody's grandma, like, can we connect? And he's like, and she spit right in my face. So this is what greets these 9 courageous kids who try to go to school. All right, and so what eventually happens is that President Dwight Eisenhower sees what's going on, and he says, you can't do this, all right, Orville. You can't block these kids from going into school. Oh, by the way, he eventually, after a day or two, he withdraws the National Guard, but all the parents in the towns, the white people, still show up and harass the kids who are trying to go into school and don't let them in. And there's police there, but the police aren't stopping the mob of white people from assaulting, again, these teenagers who are black, who are trying to go to school. They're trying to go to school. And they're all like straight A students and so on and so forth. Not that you should harass anyone regardless of their grades. All right. Anyway, so instructive stuff, right? You have an executive here who is sending in armed troops and whipping up the civilian population to sort of attack a group of people who are just trying to advocate for their equality, for their own civil and human rights. as American citizens. Anyway, Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States, again, no fan of Brown versus the Board of Education at all. He was really vocally mad at Warren for passing it. He knows that this isn't the right thing. And so he actually sends in the U.S. military with fixed bayonets to escort these kids into school. He also, which I have to imagine upset a lot of people, he actually federalized the Arkansas National Guard. So he basically took the Arkansas National Guard out from under the command of the governor of Arkansas, all right, and then sent in U.S. troops, because you can imagine what a horrific scene it would have been if Phoebus sent in the National Guard to stop the kids and the U.S. the Army's there. Oh my God, it could have been horrible. It was horrible. Could have even been more horrible. Anyway, so those kids did get to go to school. It was not fun. You can read their accounts of it. It's pretty amazing stuff. There's documentaries made on them. I highly recommend checking out the Little Rock Nine. All of which, except one, there are 8 of the Little Rock Nine are still alive. Okay, so again, when we're looking at like, well, why does this old stuff matter? Because all of these people, except one, are still alive. All right, they're still living. You can go talk to them. The following year, Orville Phoebus closed the schools for an entire year. He closed all the schools in Little Rock. That was how he got back at Eisenhower. 58, 59, there was no school. That actually led to an enormous amount of hate crimes, white people attacking the black community, blaming them for their kids not being able to have school for a year. So he would rather close down the entire school system, right, than fully represent all of the Americans that were the Arkansans, I don't know, Arkansans? How do you say it? The people who were who he was representing. All right, let's take it a little closer to up here. Let's talk about Boston. So maybe you've heard about this, maybe you haven't, but from 1974 to 1988, all right, I was in high school in 1988. Boston was under federal supervision for desegregating their schools. Remember that Brown v. Board of Ed happens in 1954, all right? Boston, all right, Massachusetts, we like to think that we're pretty progressive and so on and so forth. We like to judge people down south for being racist, all right? 20 years after Brown v. Board of Ed, Boston had done nothing to desegregate its schools, all right? Its schools were as grossly segregated as anywhere else in the country. And so federal government got involved. They put a judge in charge of overseeing it, and basically the idea was that people were going to be bused from neighborhood to neighborhood to desegregate the schools, to integrate the schools. And it was violent. There was, again, a lot of white parents showed up, and community members and so on and so forth, to prevent black kids from getting into schools. White kids refused to go to black schools, and so on and so forth. There was a lot of racial violence, violence between white and black students in schools. There was a horrific situation where a black student stabbed a white student at South Boston High School, and hundreds of community members surrounded the school, wouldn't let people in or out. They end up installing metal detectors. This is one of the first schools to ever do that. And they were actually sending 500, where is it? Is that right? Did I write it down? Yeah, they sent something like 500 police in to watch a school of 400 kids. It was crazy. That very famous, iconic image of a black attorney who's coming out of City Hall in Boston, who's grabbed by a couple white teenagers, and there's a white kid who's swinging an American flag at him. It looks like he's going to stab him with it. Apparently he swung it at him, but if you see the photograph, it's like, it looks like he's going to harpoon this guy with it. So insanely crazy. And I think I shared with you the experiences of this woman I went to grad school with in Springfield, which is even closer to home, who also, as a teenager, 13, 14 years old, being bused to a white middle school, and the white parents showing up and trying to turn over the bus because a bunch of black kids from a different part of town were being sent to that school. And that's the 1970s. The result was a massive exodus of white people from Boston to the outlying suburbs. And that's how people chose to deal with it. So again, you have this ruling, you say, okay, we're going to desegregate the schools. Finally, there's going to be some diversity in these schools. But then what happens is people move out of town. Now, I will say that I know a lot of people who have gone to school in Boston, and there have been some pretty good successes with, busing kids around to suburbs and so on and so forth. There has been some positives in that. But this is just a reminder that we up here, we Yankees up here in the North, we can't get we don't want to hurt our hand patting ourselves on the back too much. This stuff is just as real here as it is anywhere else. So, after all this desegregation finally happens and we finally sort of settle into a situation where, wow, we might really have some diversity in schools and so on and so forth. I mean, we don't really, but maybe we can feel good about it for a second. Just within the past, 5 to 10 years, there has been this really big movement for neighborhood schools. And there's been a lot of talk about it, about reinstating neighborhood schools. And there are some definite pluses. If there's a school that's 3 blocks over, why shouldn't your kid be able to just sort of walk to their school? But this movement has come in to sort of, because people have forgotten about what it was like when schools were segregated. Neighborhoods are still going to be segregated, apparently. All right. So the idea of going back to neighborhood schools is the sort of thing that is going to resegregate schools if we sort of embrace it. And there are certainly people who are pushing for that to happen. Lastly, I should say, and it's not a small point at all. You want to talk about schooling, you want to talk about equality, you want to talk about what it really comes down to. Schools are funded by property taxes in the town or city where they happen. In most places, in Massachusetts they are. All right? So the wealthier a community, the better the school can be. And that's, you can certainly argue that's class, it's not specifically race. But again, when we look at where the wealth lies economically from, and we look at that in another episode, wealth skews very highly towards white. And either way, it's still class. The point is that if we're going to continue to just fund schools based on how much money the people in that town make, we're going to have unequal schools. And that's going to shake out to hurt students of color until we have wealth equality in America, not just income equality. All right? Why do people talk about reparations? Because the difference in wealth. So what's the thesis of this? What am I trying to say with this? I'm trying to say, look, we want to stop racism when we can. We want to try to make the world more equal. We want to live up to these American ideals that we, that we love, the things that we love about America and what America is supposed to be about. All right? And so if we're going to fight racism, if we're going to try to make things equal for people, okay, we have to keep our eye on the ball. Because even though you have this landmark Supreme Court case in 1954, all right, and people can celebrate and they can say, okay, great, we solved racism. All right, we can go back to our lives. Remember what I said during that introduction. All right, racism is a bad dream for white people. All right, something bad happens, you focus on it, it gets stuck in your head. Maybe it really impacts how you're living your life for a little while, and then you can forget about it. All right, but we can't forget about it because too many people are invested in keeping things unequal. All right, and so even if we have one victory, we need to actually see it through, make sure that it's really having the effect, the equalizing effect that we hope it is. Okay? So anyway, please understand that you can look at almost any topic that I bring up in this series or anything that you learn about in this depth. Okay? Any story is way more complex than it first seems. So I highly recommend, pick something that's interesting to you and go down that rabbit hole, see what else you can find out. Okay? All right, thanks for tuning in. See you soon.